We have with us today Gil Rabinovici, who's a neurologist and a professor at the Memory and Aging Center at the University of California in San Francisco. Gil's been with us before, and thankfully he's back today. Gil actually studies posterior cortical atrophy, and Gil was on the committee that literally wrote the diagnostic guidelines. So Gil is going to talk to us today, and then he's going to take questions. And I hear a couple people who are still not muted, so if you could just mute yourselves, that would be great. Or if you're just in a quiet place, that would be great too. Gil, take it away. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jamie. Really a pleasure to be here. So what I thought I'd do is, for the first half hour or so, sort of give you a whirlwind tour of PCA, and I'm going to talk about the history of the disorder and why it's known now as Benson's disease, for those of you who have heard that term before. I'm going to discuss a little bit how we can understand the disease. So I'm going to give you a quick tutorial in neuroscience and think about which brain areas are affected and what function they serve. We'll talk a little bit about disease stages, which I know is something everyone is interested in, and try to address this confusion about how is PCA related to Alzheimer's disease. Is it a different disease? I'll talk about the approach that we have as neurologists to diagnosing, what kind of evaluations we do, what kind of imaging tests. Talk a little bit about what we know about risk factors and treatments. And I'm going to conclude just by talking about some research efforts that are ongoing around the world and opportunities to participate in the US. And then for the second part of the hour, I'm happy to field questions about the talk or about PCA in general. So the history of PCA really begins with a report in the medical literature by Frank Benson. Benson was a behavioral neurologist at UCLA, and in 1988, he published a report describing 5 patients that he cared for who presented with a progressive loss of their visual abilities with sparing of other elements of their cognition, like their memory or language functions. And the field of brain imaging was really just in its infancy at that stage, but we did have sort of early versions of CT scans and MRI scans of the brain, and Dr. Benson noticed that the patients who had these progressive visual problems showed loss of tissue or atrophy in areas in the back of their brain, what we call in medicine the posterior parts of the brain, and this is really why he dubbed the condition posterior cortical atrophy. And since Dr. Benson, who happens to be my academic grandfather, he was the mentor to my mentor, Bruce Miller, why many people feel like the disease should be named after him as Benson's disease. So I think to understand PCA, it's important to understand how our brain deals with visual information. So I'm going to give you a quick tutorial on visual processing in the brain. Can you guys see my cursor here, my arrow, as I move it around the screen? People see that?
We don't see an arrow.
You see an arrow or no?
Now, yes.
Oh, good. Okay, great. Thank you. So obviously visual information gets in through our eyes or retina, and then it's relayed to the optic nerve and through a network of connections all the way from the front of the head to the eye to the back of the brain, an area called the occipital cortex. And this area is also known as the primary visual cortex because it begins to decode the signals that are coming from the retina and start to reconstruct for the brain the visual imagery of the world. So telling the brain about light and lines and contours, shapes, colors. And then the information becomes increasingly complex as visual information is processed through really 2 parallel streams in the brain. So visual information goes up from this area here in the occipital cortex up to this area, sort of in the top back of the brain, called the parietal cortex. And this stream through this stream, the brain really tells us about spatial relationships, where things are in the visual world compared to each other. It helps us detect spatial relationships. It helps us detect where objects are. So this pathway is also known as the where stream because it really tells our brain where things are in the world. And in parallel, the information goes down into this part of the brain called the temporal lobe, kind of close to our ears, and that helps our brain understand what it is that we're seeing. So recognize faces that should be familiar, recognize objects, look at letters and decode words. So this area here is called the where stream. And really in PCA, there's progressive dysfunction of all of these different elements of visual processing. So trouble with primary visual processing, colors and shapes, trouble with spatial relationships because of involvement of these areas here in the where stream, and also in many people, trouble identifying what it is that they're seeing visually because of trouble here in the what stream. So the early visual symptoms in PCA can be really nonspecific. I think a really common one is difficulty reading, which is why I've highlighted it. Reading requires a lot of visual integration. So our eyes need to be able to see full words. They need to be able to move across a page or a screen and stay on the line. Our brain needs to be able to identify the meaning of the letters and form words. And so difficulty reading can be a very common early symptom in PCA. Another sort of daily function that requires a lot of visual processing is driving. And so initially, people might just feel like they have a lack of confidence when they're driving, and this represents just some problem with the typically automatic visual processing that we're used to and really rely on when we drive. Folks then develop trouble judging distances, locating items. So a common complaint is, people have trouble locating things that are right in front of them, the TV remote, the leftover Chinese food from last night. It's right there, but the brain just can't identify where it is in space. Some patients, as I mentioned, have trouble identifying familiar faces or objects that they see. So really, these trouble with spatial relationships, the trouble identifying objects represent dysfunction of those visual processes that I described in the last slide, so the where stream and the what stream. And then folks can have trouble with basic visual processing, trouble with peripheral vision, bumping into objects, really identifying boundaries or obstacles, and this relates to dysfunction of primary visual processing in the brain. And then the same areas that are really important for vision are also important for other cognitive functions. And so there are many non-visual symptoms that can occur in PCA. Very early on, people might have trouble performing mental math or handling money, calculating change or tip in their head. There can be trouble finding words just in day-to-day conversation, trouble writing, trouble using devices, technology, some confusion between left and right, trouble dressing, including trouble orienting clothes in the right way, sometimes putting things on upside down or backwards. And then really our balance or vestibular system really relies on the visual information that our brain is getting. And so when that visual information is short-circuiting, people can complain of dizziness or imbalance because their vestibular or balance systems are not getting that visual input that they're expecting. So this is an experiment that was done by Sebastian Crutch, one of my colleagues at University College London. And this experiment, I think, gives us a little bit insight into the visual experience that people have with PCA. And so in this study, Sebastian and his colleagues had people look at visual scenes like the one that you see on the top of the screen, and they actually tracked how their eyes were scanning the scene as they were looking at it. And so the circles that you see represent areas where people fixated on different elements in the visual scene that they were presented with, and the numbers represent the time in milliseconds that they spent looking at these different objects. And so what I'm showing you here is actually how a control or someone without PCA with normal vision scans this scene. And as you would expect, people scan all the salient items throughout the scene, and they spend the most times looking at the things like the buildings or the people, trying to make sense of what it is that they're seeing. So this would be a normal sort of eye scanning procedure. And what you see now on the bottom is how a patient with PCA was scanning this scene. And so first of all, you can see that this person actually misses most of the right side of the scene. Their eyes don't even notice this part of the visual scene. And then while there is some time spent looking at the salient features like the buildings, you can see that a lot of time is spent on parts of the scene that don't really provide any useful information. So just gazing at different parts of the ocean. And you get a sense that instead of the brain sort of integrating the entire scene and then scanning its different features like you see up top here for a control, the person with PCA is really just seeing little bits of the picture and not able to figure out the big picture from all these little elements, not able to integrate all that information. So that, to me, helps give a little insight into what the visual experience might be like with PCA. Now, one very important element of PCA is that it tends to affect people at a younger age than a lot of brain diseases like typical Alzheimer's disease. What you see on this graph is the age of onset of patients who were part of a large multi-center international study of PCA. And so the higher the bars, the more patients had a specific age. So you can see that the most common age that people developed symptoms was kind of in their late 50s. And you can see, in fact, that most of the people who were in this study developed symptoms in their 50s and 60s. Very few people developed symptoms at a younger age, and importantly, very few people also developed symptoms over the age of 70 or so. This would be very different if we looked at the age of symptom onset in typical memory-predominant Alzheimer's disease, where people develop memory loss. They're the most common age for onset of symptoms would be somewhere in the mid to late 70s. So this is really shifted towards earlier in life for reasons that we don't really understand. And so what do we know about the epidemiology of PCA? Most commonly, it presents in people in their 50s or 60s. Most studies suggest that females are more affected than males, and we really don't have very good estimates about how many people are affected in the US or across the world. I know Jamie is trying to collect some of that information through her efforts, but studies suggest that roughly 5 to 20% of all patients who present with Alzheimer's disease and are seen in specialty clinics like our memory clinic at UCSF or other university-based centers, about 5 to 20% of all people with Alzheimer's disease seen in these specialty clinics are presenting with PCA. The progression really differs between patients. The visual problems do progress over time to functional blindness, meaning that people just are unable to see, unable to do tasks that require vision. And over time, most people develop problems with other functions of the brain like memory or language, judgment, problem solving, but how fast this occurs and how restricted the disease stays to the visual system versus becoming a more general brain disease really varies from patient to patient. So people have proposed this staging system for PCA. I'll go through it. I think it's mainly helpful in sort of helping people to know what stage they're at and what maybe to expect in the future, though it doesn't really tell us about how fast patients might move from one stage to another. So let me just present this. There may be questions about this that come up during our Q&A, but the first stage is no impairment, so nothing's wrong. Stage 2 is really the very earliest symptoms of PCA, and in fact, these symptoms might not be recognized as abnormal at the time because they're very nonspecific, and it may only be in hindsight when people sort of think about the earliest symptoms that they or their loved ones develop that they might view these as abnormal. And so a lot of patients just say, they have some sense that something is wrong. They can't really articulate very early on even that it's a vision problem. Again, early symptoms, trouble reading, trouble using the computer, typing, loss of confidence driving. So you can see sort of nonspecific things that in hindsight may be the very earliest signs of the disease. In stage 3, the symptoms are recognizable to patients and to their families. There are obvious problems with vision, locating things. People might describe being clumsy when they're trying to pour into a glass or bumping into things, whereas before they weren't clumsy, trouble managing money, reading again. But people are able to compensate for this and to function largely independently. At stage 4, the visual loss becomes increasingly impactful on just day-to-day tasks, and people start to require some assistance with some of those tasks that rely heavily on intact vision. And this is when a lot of people start to develop early signs of memory loss or word-finding problems. Stage 5, vision is really quite significantly compromised, and people require assistance with most everyday tasks, and other non-visual symptoms become more prominent. In stage 6, people are functionally blind, basically need support for all their visual activities. At this stage, most everyone has some global cognitive problems. There may be some changes in behavior and personality. Incontinence might develop. And really, stage 7 is the last stage of the disease where patients have no real meaningful interactions with others, unable to walk, and really rely on others for all the basic self-care. So not everyone reaches these very late stages, but if people live indefinitely sort of with PCA, this is what can happen at the end stages. So what is the relationship between PCA and Alzheimer's disease? So let me begin first by defining what is Alzheimer's disease, or how do we think of it from a medical point of view. Alzheimer's disease is really defined by two proteins that deposit in the brain called plaques and tangles. So shown here in a blue circle is this flowery appearing structure. This is a post-mortem brain, or a brain of someone who's passed away, that's stained to look for these proteins, the plaques and the tangles. And so circled in blue here is an amyloid plaque that's composed of a sticky protein called the amyloid beta, or A beta protein. And these structures here, shown in the red circle, are actually inside neurons or brain cells. These are called neurofibrillary tangles, and they are composed of a sticky protein called tau. And so the definitive way to diagnose Alzheimer's disease is when someone's brain is examined after they pass away, and the pathologist can identify these plaques and tangles in the brain. And when they're in the brain at a certain amount, that basically defines Alzheimer's disease, regardless of the kind of symptoms that people have. Now, while most people who have these plaques and tangles in the brain present with memory loss, there can be other brain areas affected, and in that case, people have other symptoms. And what you see on this slide is really the breakdown of the percent of patients that we see at UCSF who have Alzheimer's disease and what their primary problem is. So about 63% of all the patients that we see have a memory loss as their earliest and most predominant symptom. But you can see 18% actually have trouble with language and communication through language. And PCA is common and involves about 13% of all the patients that we see. So right around that 5 to 20% estimate that I gave you. And then there are still other problems who present with primary changes in behavior, about 6%. That's a relatively less common manifestation of Alzheimer's disease. And so what's the relationship between PCA and Alzheimer's disease? Well, PCA is really defined based on the symptoms, based on having these progressive problems with vision and visual processing in the brain. And people who have the symptoms
Gil, we can't hear you anymore. Gil? Hang tight, everybody. I think that for some reason he got disconnected, so hang tight and hopefully he'll come back online. And right now, I can just try to call him.
Hey, it looks like I got disconnected. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you,
Okay.
Gil.
So where was I when I got disconnected?
You were talking about how the differences, the similarities and differences between Alzheimer's and the other phenotypes.
Was I on this slide?
That's a good place to start.
Yeah, that was the slide you were on.
It. Yeah, that's it.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. So this slide just shows the proportion of people that have Alzheimer's disease and are seen at our clinic at UCSF and what their primary symptoms are. And so the point of this slide was really to show that while memory loss is the most common presenting symptom that we see in people who have Alzheimer's disease, and that's the most common symptom in 63% of the people that we see, about 13% of all people that we see with Alzheimer's disease present actually with visual problems. And so what is the relationship between PCA and, which is really a syndrome based on the symptoms that we talked about, trouble with vision, and Alzheimer's disease, which is this biological entity that's defined by plaques and tangles? Well, the connection is that about 80% of all people who have the PCA clinical symptoms and come to autopsy are found to have the plaques and tangles of Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's is the cause or the disease causing PCA in about 80% of people. The brain, when examined at autopsy, looks a little different though than the brain of people who had a memory predominant form of Alzheimer's disease, in that there is more pathology, particularly more tangles in visual areas of the brain than in memory areas in people who had PCA, whereas people who had memory predominant Alzheimer's disease tend to have more tangles in memory areas of the brain and relatively fewer tangles in visual areas. So really, where the tangles are found in the brain relates to the symptoms that people had during life. Now, about 20% of people who have PCA during life are found to have a different kind of brain disease. And you might have heard of some of these disorders: Lewy body disease, corticobasal degeneration. I'm not going to get into these in detail, but I think all I'll say is that there are other features, usually trouble with movement or motor function, that might suggest that these other disorders are present as opposed to Alzheimer's disease as the primary cause of PCA. So how do we make the diagnosis as neurologists? Really the key to the diagnosis is getting a good history. And that's why we ask a lot of questions when we interview folks and when we interview family members. We really need to get a good sense of the early symptoms and how things progressed. PCA doesn't start suddenly. It doesn't happen overnight. So if people have, a sudden change in their vision, that's much more suggestive of a stroke or an acute process. It tends to be a slowly, insidiously progressive process. And it's really important to rule out primary eye disease and make sure that it's not the eye that's causing the trouble with vision, that it really is processing in the brain. We do some neuropsychological testing. I'll show you some examples of how we test vision using paper and pencil tests. We do some brain imaging, like MRIs and CAT scans. Some of you may have heard of the PET scans. And more, we actually, as neurologists, have access to markers of the plaques and tangles that can determine whether people have plaques and tangles in their brain by examining the spinal fluid levels of the amyloid and tau protein, or by doing special PET scans that can detect amyloid plaques and soon also the tau tangles. So this is really our armamentarium as neurologists to try to help give people an accurate diagnosis. So here's an example of some tests that we do in the clinic. We have people copy things. Some of you may recognize these designs, the pentagons, or copy a complicated design, and this gives us some insight into how the brain is processing spatial information. You can see that in these copies, these are folks who have PCA. There's really a lot of difficulty seeing these complicated shapes and copying them. Drawing a clock might be another example of something that people will commonly do in the office to assess spatial function. This is a test called fragmented letters that's very helpful in looking at visual processing. So what you can see is that we give little parts of a full letter, but we don't provide the full letter. So this would be an E, an N, and a K. And people who have PCA will have a lot of trouble sort of filling in the gaps and seeing these letters. This is a task called the number location task, where we ask people to say, what is the location of this dot? Which number does it correspond to? So you can see this is a test of the where stream, or looking at spatial relationships. The correct answer here is 2, for those who are curious. And then I mentioned that people might have trouble recognizing faces. And so here's a task where we show someone a face and we ask them to match it to one of these 4 other faces. So these are all just examples of tests that we do in the office to assess visual function and visual processing. An MRI scan is done to rule out other causes of other brain diseases like strokes, but we also can detect loss of tissue in the brain. And so this is an example of an MRI scan in someone who has PCA. And what I want to show you, you see how packed the brain is here in the front. So this represents the front of the brain, and you can see that the tissue is very dense. Whereas when we look at the back of the brain, you can see a lot more space between the different folds of the brain, all these black spaces here. So this may not be, super obvious if you haven't looked at a lot of MRI scans, but I think you can appreciate the difference between the front of the brain, where there's normal concentration of tissue, and the back or posterior parts of the brain where there's tissue loss. Again, this is where the disease gets its name, posterior cortical atrophy. This is a scan that we do called a PET scan, where we look at the metabolic activity in the brain, how much the brain takes up sugar. The brain takes a lot of energy, uses a lot of sugar, and what you see in this case is all this red here in the front of the brain represents normal uptake of glucose or sugar in brain areas that are functioning normally. But again, when we get to the back of the brain, we don't see as much red. We see more yellow and green, and these represent areas of the brain that are less active because they are already impaired by PCA. Now, of course, the brain works as networks, and there are actually imaging techniques called functional MRI when we can look at network activity in the brain. And so this is an example of a study that we published this year where we found changes in network activity in the brain in PCA. What you see here in blue is that we found less activity of the visual networks in the brain. But actually, all this red and yellow represents increased activity in other brain networks, trying to compensate for the dysfunction of these visual areas. And I'll just highlight this brain network here, which is very important for emotional and social processing. And so we think that emotional and social function is really preserved, sometimes perhaps even heightened in PCA. And here's actual evidence showing increased activities of these social and emotional networks in the brain in people who have PCA compared to controls. I mentioned that we can image plaques and tangles now in the brain. So these are more PET scans, but here in red, you can see areas of the brain where someone has plaques. And in this column here in red represents areas of the brain where people have tangles. This is actually the first patient with PCA in whom we were able to get brain scans for both amyloid plaques and tau tangles. And you can see that this person has both plaques and tangles in their brain on the red signal, and that the tangles tend to be more in the back areas of the brain, in the visual areas of the brain. And just to show, this is the metabolic activity in the MRI scan of the same patient. And I just want to highlight that where the tangles are is the areas of the brain that are showing less activity. So you can see all the tangles, for example, here in the area I'm outlining, and that corresponds to less activity in this back part of the brain. So really where the tangles are the parts of the brain that are not functioning normally. Okay, we get a lot of questions about genetics. PCA we don't think is a very heritable condition. Patients typically don't have a family history. It is really not associated with mutations in genes that cause familial forms of Alzheimer's disease. And what we know about the genetics suggests that there's even a weak association with other genetic risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, like the ApoE4 gene that you might have heard about. This is a strong risk factor for developing a memory loss type of Alzheimer's. But it's only a weak risk factor for developing PCA. This was a study that we were part of, again, led by the London group, where we all combined DNA samples from over 300 people with PCA, seen at 11 centers across the US and Europe. And in this study, we discovered 3 new candidate genes that may be associated with an increased risk of getting PCA. And interestingly, all these genes were really important for development of the retina and visual pathways in the brain and for cell signaling in those areas. So maybe an important clue as to why people get PCA. This is work from Zach Miller at UCSF, and what Zach found is that people who have PCA have higher than expected rates of learning differences related to spatial skills, math, numeracy, map reading. So we found those kind of learning differences in about 12% of patients that we saw with PCA compared to 6% in the population, so more than double the rate of these learning differences. And that suggests that there may be a weakness, a relative weakness to some of these visual areas in the brain as people's brain develop. And that might be a reason that some people manifest symptoms of PCA because those areas were sort of vulnerable or susceptible to begin with. The treatments that we have for PCA, the drug treatments, as you know, are very limited. So we use the medications that are proven to work in Alzheimer's disease, a class of medications called cholinesterase inhibitors. This is the medicine class that Aricept belongs to, among other drugs. Namenda or memantine for more advanced disease stages. So the same drugs that we use to treat typical Alzheimer's disease. Of course, we treat other symptoms like depression if they're present. I think really important, though, is taking advantages of some resources that are available for people who are blind and partially sighted, like audiobooks or talking watches. There are a lot of cell phones now that have simplified displays. Voice recognition software is increasingly helpful in people who have trouble seeing the screen or typing on a screen. I think Jamie probably has shared a lot of recommendations that we make about modifying the environment, for example, in the home, to reduce clutter, to make things stand out, to provide some contrast that will help people identify boundaries or obstacles like stairs. And so really there is a lot of change done in the home to optimize the environment. And then there are certainly rehabilitation and supportive services like occupational and physical therapy, the Facebook group, other support groups, the Alzheimer's Association resources. Getting down to just the last couple of slides, really this just is meant to show you some recent papers from this collaborative effort that we have across the world to try to understand PCA better. And this involves really leading universities from around the world, Europe, US, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea. Everyone's sort of trying to put their brains together and work together to try to understand the disease. And one thing that we can do is we can share not only our experiences, but also data that we have, DNA, brain scans, because PCA is a relatively rare disease, to really have large numbers or a lot of data to try to study different elements of the disease. We really need these international collaborations, and these are ongoing. An important study for people with PCA to know about in the United States is the longitudinal early onset AD, or LEAD study. I think the PI of this study, Liana Apostolova, gave a talk to this group recently. But in this study, we're really trying to develop a network of sites that are studying different forms of early age of onset Alzheimer's disease. Early age of onset, I mean people who develop symptoms under age 65, and this includes PCA as well as typical memory loss or other forms of Alzheimer's disease. And you can see there's 15 centers across the United States, so UCSF, UCLA, Houston Methodist, I won't go through all of them, Harvard, Penn, Johns Hopkins, sites in Florida, Mayo Clinic in Florida and Rochester. Emory in Atlanta. So just to show you that there are different sites across the US, and we're all collaborating to follow patients who have PCA and other forms of early onset Alzheimer's, do cognitive testing, MRI scans, PET scans, spinal fluid collections, blood collection, DNA and RNA, and combine all the data to follow people to try to understand the disease. And really the ultimate goal of this effort is actually to develop a network of sites that will help to facilitate clinical trials of new and exciting therapies for patients with PCA and other forms of early onset. So that concludes sort of a formal didactic part of this presentation. Want to acknowledge the great people that I get to work with every day at UCSF, collaborators, and funding sources. And I think I'll stop there and then take any questions about the presentation or general questions about PCA. I did want to just make one caveat, which is that I'm not able, for reasons that you can probably understand, to provide direct medical advice. And so please don't ask me any, medical advice questions. I just can't do that, but I'm happy to answer more general questions.
Wonderful. So the way we're going to do the questions is we're going to raise our hand and I will unmute you. And we're going to start with Steve.
There we go. Yes, thank you, Doctor. Very good information. I think many of us who are caregivers to people with PCA unfortunately find out that there's not a whole lot known about PCA in different parts of the medical community and in the caregiver community. I was wondering if you have any advice as to how to best inform other medical providers or caregivers about PCA and the specific challenges that someone with PCA faces on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's a really good point. We've really been trying to raise awareness around medical professionals so that people will be able to recognize PCA when they see it. And that includes neurologists, but it also includes eye doctors. I think most people with PCA actually end up going to an optometrist or an ophthalmologist for their initial evaluation. And, there's no easy answers here. I think, part of what we're trying to do is disseminate information through meetings, giving courses, publishing papers in the medical literature. But it is a very difficult problem. How do you make people more aware of, less common disorders that they might not see every day? I think from a patient and caregiver point of view, I think there are a lot of really good resources, and I imagine Jamie has shared a lot of those with you, but I'm happy to share the ones that we use at UCSF with our patients. But, they're just very brief and, communications or pamphlets that describe what the healthcare professional needs to know, what caregivers might want to know about the disease. And just sharing that with, the people who are caring for your loved ones, I think could be very helpful. I think, doctors want to help patients. They'll certainly take the time to read a short pamphlet, to give them the key things that they need to know and to educate them. And hopefully, efforts like this, social media, in today's information age, will help get the word out about PCA.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. No, I just wanted to add one more thing, which is, celebrity spokespeople actually can really help raise awareness of the disease. And so I know that in the United Kingdom, Terry Pritchard, who's a very famous author, a fantasy actually author, suffered from PCA, and that, he passed away eventually. And that actually really raised awareness in the United Kingdom because a lot of people knew who Terry Pritchard was, and the story was covered in the media and so forth. And so, we really need spokespeople to raise awareness in the general public as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Steve. Steve, can you mute yourself? And I'm going to, Carmela or George has a question.
Hi, can you hear us?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I had hopefully it's just a terminology clarification question. So Carmela has been diagnosed with PCA, and they've done the CSF scans. I mean, they've confirmed that it's Alzheimer's is the underlying cause, but recently they've talked about Parkinsonism and corticobasal syndrome, which I just wanted to confirm that the syndrome might be distinct from, because you had listed corticobasal, I guess, degeneration. Is it a correct understanding, first of all, that the underlying Alzheimer's can be the cause of corticobasal syndrome and Parkinson's? And then a sort of follow-up question of, do you see that very often?
Yeah, so the answer to both is yes. So corticobasal syndrome is another clinical syndrome, which basically means it's a conglomeration, if you will, or a pattern of symptoms that we recognize as doctors. And it does involve movement and rigidity of the muscles and that sort of thing. And it really reflects which brain areas are affected by a particular disease. And the areas that are affected in PCA and the areas that are affected in corticobasal syndrome, also known as CBS, are very close by to each other. And so it is actually common for people with PCA to develop some elements of the so-called corticobasal syndrome, or CBS, as the disease evolves. It just represents the spread of the disease from visual areas of the brain to other parts of the brain that control motor function. And in these cases, Alzheimer's disease, the plaques and the tangles can really be causing all of the symptoms. So it's not like people have a different disease causing these movement symptoms. It is usually explained by one disease, by Alzheimer's disease. So it is very common, actually, and it's one of the things that we struggled with in trying to create definitions of the disease for research centers. Is how do we split these two entities, or do we sort of lump them together as potentially one thing? And so it's a thing that doctors certainly struggle with, researchers as well. But yes, it is common, and it is likely, if there are spinal fluid or other confirmatory tests, it is likely that everything is in fact explained by Alzheimer's.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
David.
Jamie, I think you're muted now.
Thank you. If anybody has a question on the phone, they can text me. I have a question. Dave Bender, you want to unmute yourself over there?
There, I did.
I got it.
Back to the first response to Steve's questions. Is there a new pamphlet out explaining PCA? Or is anybody aware of anything new in the last year or so that'd be good for give to caregivers?
I'm not sure that there's anything within the last year, what exactly you guys have shared through the group, but I'm happy to share with Jamie and the resources that we share at UCSF. And if there's something different or helpful about, what the materials that we share, maybe you could distribute it across the group, Jamie.
I will totally do that, Dave. I will take care of that.
Okay. I got one other question too. You mentioned the medicines, the Alzheimer's medicines, and like Shirley's on Mendadine and the Exelon patch. At what point do they take that medicine off? Is there some kind of indication in the future, or when it's probably doesn't do any good anymore?
It's really hard to know, when it's working or if it's not working.
Right.
Because we know that these medicines don't make people's symptoms better, and we know that over time they don't stop the symptoms from progressing. And so we know what the medicines really do is they attenuate or slow that process down a bit. And so it's impossible to know, are the drugs working? I think a common mistake in medicine is to stop these medicines because they're quote unquote not working because people are worse. Well, we don't know. They might actually have, progressed more quickly if they were off the medicine. So I can tell you in general, we keep the medications on for the duration of the disease.
Okay.
If people are not having side effects, we continue the medications. And really, I personally, don't stop them unless, it's really the end of, the course and people are not having any sort of meaningful interactions and, giving medicine to boost cognition at that point is probably not helping anyone. So, but we continue these, if people are tolerating the medicines and aren't having side effects, they can continue to be on them for years.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much. I'm going to mute you back. Any other questions? We were talking last week, Gil, about language problems, and Dan, you were talking about how you, well, a number of people were sharing how they were having some language word finding difficulties. And this was that was kind of the first time I realized that people are having early on word finding abilities. Why is that? What is it about the brain that's going on there?
Yeah, so so language in the brain in most people, left-handed or right-handed, is predominantly in the left hemisphere of the brain. And there are areas on the left side of the brain in the parietal lobes, which are the part of the brain that are affected in PCA, that are very important in language, and in particular in reading, writing, and also in finding words. And so even if the primary problem begins with trouble with vision, it's very close to the real estate in the brain that is very important for finding words, again, for reading and writing. And so it's actually, people have studied this and shown that even though it's not the primary problem or the primary things that people complain about in early stages of PCA, actually word finding problems are very, very common. And they're common because they overlap with the parts of the brain that are affected early in PCA.
Interesting. Thank you so much. Yes, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead, Catherine.
That reminds me of a question about the anxiety level with this this disease, and what is happening, that elevates the anxiety to such an extent, where Alzheimer's doesn't. People that I've known with Alzheimer's don't seem to have that heightened anxiety.
Yeah, great question. I think there are both biological and non-biological factors involved here. So one important issue is insight, which means the awareness that people have of their own symptoms. People who have memory loss are variably aware. Some people might be very aware of their memory loss, but sometimes people actually forget that they're forgetting, and they don't notice it as much as other people. And so the individual experience is not one of, oh my gosh, there's a big problem going on, because people don't notice it as much. In PCA, by and large, people notice their symptoms. They notice them before anybody else, and they continue to notice them. And so there is, that sense that, things are wrong and not working that I'm sure contributes to anxiety. The other factor, I think, is biological, which is that, remember I showed that slide that showed that there's more network activity in brain networks that are involved in emotional and social function in people with PCA. It's actually heightened. And those same networks are actually networks that are active when people are anxious or depressed. And so I think that actually as the networks in the back of the brain that relate to vision turn down, the networks in the front of the brain that are really important for our social and emotional well-being are actually heightened. And sometimes that can be counterproductive. It could actually contribute to anxiety. And it's related to just changes in brain activity as the brain is sort of adjusting to the effects of PCA.
That's interesting. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Any questions from the online, from a phone? Yes, Megan.
Hi, thank you so much for a very helpful presentation. I realize you can't give medical advice, but what Kathy's just addressed about heightened anxiety resonates very strongly with my experience with my mother. So in very general terms, Professor, are there specific strategies or medications that you've used to treat anxiety in your patients? Because we haven't had great success on this front yet with my mother. Thank you.
Yeah, we tend to use the SSRI medications or medicines, not Prozac, which is the first of that generation, but some of the newer medicines like Celexa, citalopram, or Lexapro, known as escitalopram. We've had pretty good luck with those medications. We prefer, we tend not to use Valium type of medicines, which can help with anxiety as well. But the reason that we try to avoid them is because if you're taking a Valium type of medicine, that can also affect brain function and make symptoms worse. It can make people more susceptible to falls. And so we tend to not use those medications, though occasionally if people are really getting panic attacks and so on, we do use those. But our first go-to drugs, I would say, are Celexa or Lexapro, which are in this SSRI Prozac family of medicines.
Wonderful, thank you. Anybody else have any questions? Anybody from the phone, if you want to text? And I don't see anybody, and so if we don't have any other questions, I think that we can call it a 7-minute early. Thank you, Gil. Wait, Carmela. Yes, go ahead.
So in the presentation, Gil mentioned culinary, did I get that right? AIDS?
Yeah, something like that.
And what does he mean by that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, things that can help with just eating. So large utensils, things that are a little easier to manipulate and handle. So there are actually utensils, for example, made for people who have neurological disorders or visual disorders that can help with some of the trouble coordinating eating for people who have visual problems. So that's what I meant by that.
Okay, thank you.
Gil, I have a question, and we've discussed this about visual aids for people. We have a couple of patients who are now using canes. Do you find that helpful for people?
Yeah, I think you kind of learn to use the cane to help you assess what the environment, what's going on with the environment, just as people who are visually impaired for other reasons use them. So some of our patients, those who have really profound visual problems, do feel more confident walking with the cane. You have to learn how to use it, though. Who are blind early in life sort of learn this skill, and it's, I think, maybe a little harder to learn later on, but it is possible to learn.
I have a question from Catherine. Does the ability of neural networks to compensate account for the variability of the disease progression?
Yeah, it probably does. So in the study that I showed you, for example, there were some people who had increased activity in their memory networks as well, and that corresponded to better performance on memory tests. So it was really that their brain looked like it was compensating and able to maintain memory function. We don't understand, a fundamental question in general in Alzheimer's, and in particular in PCA, is what affects rate of progression, why some tend to have purely a visual problem for many, many years, where other people after, 2 or 3 years might have more general neurological problems. We don't know. It has something to do with how the brains are wired in networks. It may have something to do with some biological differences in the plaques, or particularly the tangles that people have. Some tangles might progress more slowly, spread more slowly through the brain. Others might progress more aggressively. So those are just some hypotheses or ideas that are out there in the field. But the truth is we don't know. And that's why, I think, one area where we fall short, certainly in terms of meeting the needs of families and patients, is prognosis, being able to tell people, what to expect in the next 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. When we say we don't know, we're being honest. We don't have ways of predicting. So, we can talk in general terms about, how people progress on average. We can talk about the stages, but the truth is that we're really pretty far from being able to tell individual people, what to expect in the short term. And that's another area of active research.
Can I ask you a question about Dr. Apostolovich's study? If anybody is interested, we saw the map. If you could send me the map, and we have patients all over the country, and is the study still open? The lead study still recruiting?
Yeah, the lead study is definitely recruiting. So we're involved in this study as well. We analyze all the PET scans in the study and also provide leadership. So I will send you the link to the clinicaltrials.gov, which lists all the sites. Really the criteria are that people are under age 65 and that they have been diagnosed with a condition associated with Alzheimer's like PCA. And then there are 15 sites across the country with probably more still to open. As you can see, we had very good coverage sort of in the Northeast and East Coast. Some other sites in the Midwest, Chicago, St. Louis, and some on the West Coast, but we don't have great coverage. But there also is some, we can help in certain situations with people's travel and so forth. So really encourage people to participate in research. And as I said, the hope is that we can actually have clinical trials of exciting new drugs that are specifically open to people with PCA. A lot of times people with PCA can't get into Alzheimer's drug trials because they're too young or because it's not a memory problem, it's a visual problem. And one thing we're trying to do with leads is really to address that gap and actually have clinical trials that are focused on people who have this particular type of Alzheimer's.
The tests that they'll be doing, like the neuropsych tests, will they be separated out for people with PCA versus people with PPA versus people with frontotemporal dementia?
So we're not to recruit people with frontotemporal dementia, but really people who have more of Alzheimer's symptoms. Everyone does the same battery of tests, recognizing that people will have more challenges with some tests than others, and that people with PCA will have challenges with any test that requires vision.
Yes.
One of the things we're trying to study is what are the best tests to measure disease stage and progression. Can we find sort of a common battery of tests that can measure it across different types of Alzheimer's, or do we really need to look at different tests for people with PCA, for example, versus people who have memory loss? And so these are actually some of the goals of the study, is to develop a battery of tests that could then be used to determine if a new drug is working, if it's improving or slowing people's symptoms.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. It's been a great talk. If anybody has any questions for Dr. Rabinovici, just email me and I'll get them to him. And Gil, you're amazing and inspiring, and much of what I do is inspired because of Gil. So thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks for everything. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Additional questions later. Okay, bye-bye.
Very good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.